Hi folks, this is, in case you missed it, PBL 502, Making Better Rubrics. We started off this session by reviewing some characteristics of rubrics that we reviewed in our last PBL rubric session with our introduction to rubrics. On the whiteboard here, you'll see that I sketched out 3 types of rubrics. The first is a checklist rubric where a teacher might list out the expectations, but not necessarily a point value for certain performance levels. So this is a checklist because we have descriptors here, we have some space, we have a line, and then we add these point values next to it. So those point values might range from 5 to 20, and we when we're ready to grade something, we arbitrarily put a number there. Checklists are tricky because it's hard to stay consistent as you grade. As you look at 15 on somebody's rubric, you may see somebody else's that warranted a 16 or 17, and it's hard to communicate that difference to students, the spectrum of 5, 10, or 15 points out of 20 for certain characteristics. The next type of rubric that we looked at was very feedback heavy. They're kind of a rough sketch outline of where a teacher would put a descriptor in one box and then leave a big area for comments or feedback. Now, feedback we know really helps students learn, but when you go to add a summative grade, putting, again, a number next to that field may not very well connect that number to the comments and feedback. So how do we blend these two together? Well, we've seen online a proliferation of what I would call spectrum or even grid rubrics, and that is you have a descriptor or a category on the far left, and then you have boxes with performance indicators and a spectrum of the skill as it develops. And so we would assign, an F or a C or an A if there were 3 columns to the different performance levels. Now, all 3 of these have their strengths or weaknesses. And in using these different types of rubrics myself, I started to design one that I believe is a little bit hybrid of all 3 of those. This is a standards-based rubric template that we downloaded yesterday from my website. I created it in Microsoft Word with some real simple tables. And of course, it can expand based on what you add to it. Now, our process for using this is going to stay standards focused so that we're keeping ourselves accountable for what our state or Common Core standards expect from us. The way that this is laid out allows us to give us a space to put the standard at the top of the document and then break it into content or skills components of that standard. A lot of our standards, especially in South Carolina, now that we're adopting the South Carolina profile of a graduate, are very skills heavy. Standards revisions have included more skills than content, and so states and, of course, parents and other stakeholders are expecting students to graduate with skills rather than just a checklist of facts that would be content focused. Now, you'll notice with the design here, going back to my 3 types of design, I've incorporated elements of this into my hybrid design. The comments, which I liked as part of the feedback-focused design, are actually over here on the far right, so that as students are reading where they fell on a rubric, you can put your comments in context of that standard and where students fell there. So how do we go about making a rubric? That was visualized on our idea board again very loosely. This is a process that's ongoing, and there's 3 main steps that I kind of outlined here. We start with our standard and reviewing that. We break it down into what are the skills and what are the content. We separate those things out because they should be graded separately. And skills being those things that students have to perform in order to show their mastery of that standard, and the content being what facts or what ideas come mostly out of our textbook demonstrate students' knowledge. So skills versus content is something that's tricky to watch out for. And then in the third step, we start filling in our rubric by transitioning some verbs into nouns. Helps me at least come up with the characteristics for a skill. And then when I'm particularly looking at content, depth of knowledge charts such as this one really help me to identify the skill levels as far as where the standards start. So they might start with a level 3 on the depth of knowledge, and then I could work backwards on my scaling down of my rubric, but more on that in just a little bit. That depth of knowledge can also influence and help us with our skills development, and it depends on what kind of standard it is. But that chart is useful in influencing both processes of developing your rubric. So really, we're going to start with the standard. We're going to set our expectation at the standard level, so that would be at the highest performance level. And then we're going to jump back. We're going to do a full reverse. So once we know what is at standard, we're then going to describe all the way back here what is fully below standards and wouldn't be accepted as meeting the standard. That makes filling in the middle column or columns, if you're using a four column rubric, that dichotomy that you set up between at standard and below helps you fill in the middle sections. So what does this look like when we start? Well, like I said, we started with some South Carolina standards. We found those from the sc.gov website. And here are a couple examples of what we worked on yesterday. We started with, this is a world geography standard. We copied that standard up here at the top. We brainstormed an idea of an activity that involved technology or that didn't involve technology. And that activity was in order to differentiate the ways in which people change their views of places and regions as a result of physical, cultural, economic, etc. Those conditions, the activity would probably be some sort of compare-contrast of two societies or three societies. We started by taking the verb out of this standard and dropping that down in the skill standard. Differentiate is a pretty high-level task. It's certainly higher than level 1 on Webb's depth of knowledge. And then we took out the content, such as their places and regions, the physical, cultural, economic, political conditions, and we put that in the content standard. Now, in our process, I said we're always going to start at the standard. So what we did was, in the idea of creating some sort of compare-contrast presentation, whether that be a video or keynote or in-person presentation, we started by using that verb in our standard, but we even expounded upon it even further. So differentiating people for why they are different, that why is a big component of differentiating two groups of people. And one of the subcomponents of differentiating is that reasons or influences are mentioned for why folks are groups of people are different. So those things such as economics, politics, religion, we included those in here in differentiating the ways in which people change or are different in different regions. So with that differentiate being at level 3 of Webb's depth of knowledge, we can then reverse and go back to level 1 in our rubric for below standards. So we looked at Webb's depth of knowledge, and we decided that arrange would be a good verb to use there. We could also have used other things such as report or name or label how groups or what the different groups are. But again, we don't get to those reasons or influences as to why they are different. So we wrote that below standard out, and then we filled in the gap in between those two. Now, the next step when we're looking at a content standard was to take these topics and make sure that the content is accurate in this compare-contrast or this presentation as we were kind of imagining it. Now, at the standard, we want to make sure that we use things like descriptions, I should say, such as accurate, and then we list out what the content is. And then we can go in the reverse and write out below standard that things are either missing or inaccurate. And then so somewhere in that spectrum, approaching standard is that students get most of those things right, but maybe not, of course, all of them. That would be a rather quick rubric. Now, we only did 2 rows. Of course, my original template had multiples because a lot of activities cover multiple standards. But this is one quick way to do a single standard in the time that we had during Tech Tuesday. Here's another example. This comes from Bio, I believe, where we took the standard of students construct explanations of how structures, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids are related to their functions in organisms. So again, if you were to pause here and read that over, you'd probably decide that the constructing explanations is the skill. We got into a good discussion here about whether or not our lab activities are having students construct explanations. And that led us, again, to talk about how we can have multiple standards addressed when we're doing a lab, for example. But we have to remember that we're held to students being able to construct an explanation. So what are some other words for explain? Well, we decided that a good explanation includes reasons why those characteristics are included. And then we went back and said that good explanations need to be understood. So the reverse would be that the explanation cannot be understood. We filled things in from there. Here you notice that we talked about the unknowns. That's because the activity that we had in mind here was a lab activity where students identified through testing these kind of unknown products in their lab. And then their job was to correctly identify and match carbohydrates to the sample that they got, or to of the 4 samples that they tested. So being able to identify the characteristics in that lab helped to demonstrate mastery of that standard. Now, that lab alone, in just identifying the unmatched ones, this was a discussion that we had, doesn't cover the full standard if we just did this part. Students need to be able to go back and explain why they identified 2 or 3 or 4 of those unknowns and what characteristics led to that identification in that lab. So that is the quick version of creating a rubric. Remember our process. We started by copying the standard into our rubric template. We broke apart the standard into any skills or content. And in deciding what went through our spectrum, we decided to turn some verbs into nouns so that it was easier to describe them. And we can also consider as a strategy for making the standard easier, looking at the depth of knowledge level in charts like this, deciding where the standard is written, and then reversing our rubric to engineer it so that students progress up to that level toward mastery. Thanks for tuning in to this in case you missed it for Tech Tuesday. Let me know if you have any questions or requests regarding this template and this process.